Imagine waking up one morning and the news tells you that the United States has just bombed another country. Not a proxy, not a warning shot, a full-scale military operation. Missiles in the air, nuclear sites on fire, a supreme leader dead. That is not a movie trailer. That is what happened on February 28, 2026. And here's the part that should stop you cold. It didn't come out of nowhere. This moment, this war, has been building for over 40 years, and almost nobody in America was paying close enough attention to see it coming. Today, we're going to fix that. We are going to walk through the entire story, from the very roots of the conflict to the secret assassinations, the nuclear standoff, the failed diplomacy, and finally, the night the bombs started falling on Tehran. By the end of this video, you will understand not just what happened, but why, and more importantly, whether the United States made the right call. Let's go back, way back. When most Americans think about Iran, they think about the hostage crisis of 1979, 52 American diplomats held for 444 days. That was the moment the relationship broke. But the roots go even deeper than that. For decades before 1979, Iran was actually a close American ally. The U.S. helped put Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in power back in 1953 in a CIA-backed coup that overthrew Iran's democratically elected prime minister. That decision haunted American foreign policy for generations. When the Islamic Revolution swept the Shah out of power in 1979, the new government under Ayatollah Khomeini declared the United States the Great Satan and Israel the Little Satan. That wasn't just rhetoric, it became the official ideology of the Iranian state. From that point forward, Iran began building what they called an axis of resistance. Instead of fighting the US and Israel directly, which they knew they couldn't win, Iran funded and armed proxy groups across the Middle East, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, militia groups in Iraq and Syria. Iran became the puppet master, pulling strings across the entire region without ever officially being at war. And for decades, that strategy worked. But then came October 7, 2023. On that day, Hamas launched the deadliest attack on Jewish civilians since the Holocaust. Nearly 1,200 Israelis killed, hundreds taken hostage. It was a catastrophic failure of Israeli intelligence and a massive escalation of the conflict. Israel responded with devastating military force in Gaza, and the region began to boil. Here's what most people missed in the immediate aftermath. October 7th didn't just start a war in Gaza. It started a chain reaction that would ultimately lead to the total collapse of Iran's entire regional strategy. Think about what Iran had spent decades building. Hezbollah was supposed to be their most powerful deterrent against Israel, a heavily armed militia with over 150,000 rockets aimed at Israeli cities. Hamas was supposed to be a permanent thorn in Israel's side. Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad gave Iran a land bridge to supply weapons to Lebanon. The Houthis in Yemen were supposed to threaten global shipping lanes. Within about 14 months of October 7, all of that started to fall apart. Israel assassinated Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran in July 2024. Think about that for a second. Not in Gaza, not in Lebanon, in the Iranian capital itself. That was a message. Then, in September 2024, Israel killed Hezbollah's supreme leader, Hassan Nasrallah, in a massive airstrike in Beirut. the man who had led Hezbollah for over 30 years, gone. Then, in December 2024, the Assad regime in Syria collapsed. Rebel forces toppled a government that had been in power for over 50 years, cutting Iran's land bridge to Lebanon permanently. By early 2025, the axis of resistance that Iran had spent 40 years building was essentially dismembered. And that's when Israel saw its window. But before we get to the strikes, we need to talk about the nuclear program, because that is the thing that makes Iran truly different from any other regional rival. Iran's nuclear program has been a source of international tension for over 2 decades. The core question is simple: is Iran trying to build a nuclear bomb? Iran has always said no. They claim their enrichment program is purely for civilian energy purposes. And technically, enriching uranium for power is legal under international law. But here's where it gets complicated. To make a nuclear bomb, you need uranium enriched to about 90% purity. For civilian power, you need around 3 to 5%. Iran had been enriching uranium to 60%, just one technical step away from weapons grade. And by May 2025, the International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed that Iran had accumulated enough enriched uranium to potentially build 9 nuclear warheads. 9. And Iran had also been developing long-range ballistic missiles, missiles that could reach Israel easily, missiles that, if improved further, could eventually reach the United States. For Israel, this was an existential threat, not a hypothetical, not a political talking point. In their calculation, a nuclear-armed Iran meant the potential annihilation of the Jewish state. Israel has a simple principle when it comes to existential threats: they don't wait, they act. For the United States, the calculation was different, but the conclusion was increasingly similar. A nuclear Iran would destabilize the entire Middle East, threaten major oil supplies, and fundamentally alter the global balance of power. Now, here's where the Trump factor comes in, and it's crucial to understand this. When Donald Trump returned to the presidency in January 2025, he immediately reinstated what his team called the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. This meant maximum economic sanctions, maximum diplomatic isolation, and a very clear message: get rid of your nuclear program or face consequences. Trump also sent a personal letter to Iran's supreme leader, Khamenei, in March 2025, offering to negotiate. Khamenei's response? He called the idea of talks not intelligent, wise, or honorable. Here's an important detail that often gets lost. In early 2025, Trump's own intelligence director, Tulsi Gabbard, testified to Congress that the U.S. intelligence community assessed that Iran was not currently building a nuclear weapon. Not yet. They had the capability. They had the enriched material. But they hadn't made the final decision to weaponize. So why did the U.S. attack? That's the question we have to grapple with, honestly. The answer lies in what happened next. In April 2025, something surprising happened. Trump announced that the U.S. and Iran would hold direct nuclear talks, the first direct American-Iranian talks since Trump had blown up the nuclear deal back in 2018. Talks were held in Oman, mediated by the Omani government, a neutral party that had played this role before. For a moment, it looked like diplomacy might actually work. Iran seemed willing to negotiate. The U.S. had demands. There was a framework for a possible deal. But here's the thing. While the U.S. was negotiating with Iran, Israel was not. Israel was planning. Israeli officials had made their position absolutely clear. They would not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapons capability. Period. No negotiations, no deals, no waiting. Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar said military action was urgently needed, even with, quote, significant risks involved. The window of opportunity was now. Iran's defenses had been weakened. Its allies had been destroyed. Its air defense systems had been largely wiped out in previous Israeli strikes in October 2024. And critically, the United States, under Trump, was more aligned with Israel's position than any previous administration had been. Then came June 2025, the first major war. On June 13, 2025, Israel launched a massive surprise attack on Iran. Military facilities, nuclear sites, air defense infrastructure, all hit in a coordinated wave of airstrikes. Iran's air defenses, already weakened by previous Israeli strikes, were overwhelmed. The attack killed prominent military leaders, nuclear scientists, and caused widespread damage. Iran fired back. Over 550 ballistic missiles and more than 1,000 suicide drones aimed at Israel. The scale of the retaliation was staggering, but Israel's layered air defense system, the Arrow, David Sling, and Iron Dome, along with active support from the United States Navy, shot down the vast majority of incoming threats. For 9 days, the world watched in horror as two nations exchanged the most intense direct military strikes in the history of the modern Middle East. Then, on June 22, 2025, the United States entered the fight directly. American forces struck 3 Iranian nuclear sites, Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan. These weren't peripheral facilities. These were the heart of Iran's nuclear program. The underground bunkers, the centrifuge halls, the enrichment facilities that Iran had spent decades building and protecting. The Pentagon estimated the strikes set Iran's nuclear program back to 2 years. Iran responded by firing missiles at the American base in Qatar. Limited damage, but a direct attack on U.S. forces nonetheless. And then, on June 24, 2025, Trump announced a ceasefire. The 12-day war was over. The critical question that everyone was asking after the ceasefire: did it work? The honest answer is partially. Iran's nuclear program was damaged, but not destroyed. Some enriched uranium stockpiles survived in facilities that remained undamaged. Iran still had its ballistic missile capabilities. The regime was shaken, but standing. And then, something unexpected happened inside Iran that changed the entire equation. In January 2026, massive protests erupted across Iran, the largest protests since the Islamic Revolution itself. Iranians were furious. The economy was in ruins from years of sanctions. The infrastructure was crumbling. Young Iranians who had watched their country get bombed while the government spent billions on proxy wars in other countries were finally reaching a breaking point. The Iranian government responded with overwhelming force. Thousands of protesters were killed, thousands more arrested. The world watched as the Iranian regime turned its military on its own people. But those protests had a geopolitical consequence that nobody quite anticipated. They revealed just how weak and isolated the Iranian government had become, and they made regime change seem suddenly possible. Meanwhile, the nuclear talks continued. In February 2026, there were intensive back-channel negotiations in Geneva, mediated once again by Oman. The U.S. had three core demands: a permanent end to all uranium enrichment, dismantlement of key nuclear facilities, and a verifiable inspection regime. Iran was, apparently, close to agreeing. The night before the February 28th attack, the Omani mediator reportedly briefed American officials that major progress had been made, that Iran had agreed in principle to surrender its enriched uranium stockpile, that a deal might be days away. And then, the bombs fell anyway. Why? This is where historians will argue for decades, and where Americans deserve a straight, honest answer. Here is what we know. The IAEA had just discovered that Iran had been hiding highly enriched uranium in an underground facility at Isfahan that had survived the previous June 2025 strikes. Iran had been secretly continuing to enrich uranium even while negotiating. Whether this was deliberate deception or a faction of the Iranian military acting independently of the negotiators, we still don't know for certain. That discovery changed the calculation overnight. It suggested that Iran could not be trusted to negotiate honestly, that any deal was potentially a stalling tactic while they continued secretly building their nuclear capability. At his State of the Union address in late February 2026, President Trump told the American public that Iran had restarted its nuclear program and was developing missiles capable of striking the United States. 2 days later, on the night of February 28, 2026, the strikes began. What happened next was unlike anything the modern Middle East had ever seen. This was not the 12-day war. This was something fundamentally different in both scope and intent. The opening strike killed Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who had ruled Iran for 30 years, the man who had called America the Great Satan, who had built the axis of resistance, who had overseen Iran's nuclear ambitions, was killed in a targeted strike on his residence in Tehran. Simultaneously, strikes hit military installations, nuclear facilities, missile production sites, and regime infrastructure across multiple Iranian cities. The scale was massive. The intent was clear. This was not just about degrading Iran's nuclear capabilities. This was about ending the regime itself. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said the strikes would remove the existential threat posed by the terrorist regime in Iran and called on the brave Iranian people to take their destiny into their own hands.
Trump, for his part, declared that the United States had begun a major combat operation aimed at eliminating threats from the Iranian regime. He told the Iranian people this was their only chance for generations to take control of their own government. The international community reacted with a mixture of alarm and complicated silence. Some condemned the strikes. Others, particularly in the Arab Gulf states, quietly acknowledged relief that Iran's power had been diminished. The UK's Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, joined France and Germany in condemning Iran's retaliatory strikes on neighboring countries while calling for diplomacy. But Iran was not finished. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the assassinated leader, quickly consolidated power, and Iran's military went to work. Unlike the 12-day war, where Iran's retaliation was largely aimed at Israel, this time Iran widened its target map dramatically. Missiles and drone strikes hit U.S. military bases and civilian infrastructure across 9 countries in the region: Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, all came under attack.
Iran moved to restrict traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which about 20% of the world's oil supply passes. Oil prices shot past $100 a barrel. Stock markets trembled, the global economy felt the shockwaves, and the war had no end in sight. This is the part where we have to zoom out and ask the hard questions, because this isn't just a story about distant countries and geopolitics. This is a story about American choices, American power, and American consequences. Was the attack justified? The case 4. Iran was secretly enriching uranium while pretending to negotiate. The regime had already demonstrated it would not stop its nuclear program through diplomacy alone. A nuclear-armed Iran would be the most destabilizing development in the Middle East in decades. The window of opportunity, with Iran's defenses weakened and its allies dismantled, would not last forever. Waiting might have meant facing a nuclear Iran without a viable military option. The case against. At the time of the strikes, U.S. intelligence assessed that Iran had not yet made the decision to build a weapon. Diplomacy, by multiple accounts, was closer to a breakthrough than at any point in years. The targeted killing of a head of state is a massive escalation with no clear legal justification. The civilian casualties in Iran were significant. And by killing Khamenei rather than cutting a deal, the U.S. and Israel may have eliminated the one figure with the authority to actually make a nuclear concession. And there's a deeper question. When a government negotiates in apparent good faith while secretly continuing the very activity it's negotiating about, does the counterparty have the right to use force? Or does the existence of a negotiating process, however imperfect, create an obligation to exhaust all diplomatic options first? There are no easy answers, and that's precisely why this war matters to every American. Because when the United States makes the decision to enter a war, any war, it is making a decision on your behalf, with your tax dollars, in your name, with potential consequences for your sons and daughters in uniform, and for the global economy you depend on every single day.
Here's what we know about where things stand right now. As of March 2026, the war is ongoing. Iran continues to fire missiles and drones. Oil prices remain elevated. The Strait of Hormuz remains a choke point of global concern. The new Iranian leadership under Mujtaba Khamenei has shown no sign of capitulating. And the U.S. and Israel are facing what analysts are calling a war of attrition, a grinding, costly conflict with no clear endgame. The Defense Intelligence Agency estimated that even after the June 2025 and February 2026 strikes, it would still be approximately a decade before Iran could develop a missile arsenal capable of reaching the United States. Which raises the uncomfortable question: was destroying Iran's nuclear program worth the regional war that followed? History doesn't grade on intention, it grades on outcome. What is clear is that the Middle East has entered a new era. The old rules, the era of proxy wars and calculated deterrence, are over. Direct military confrontation between major state actors is now the reality, and the United States is in the middle of it. There's one more thing worth saying, and it's important. The people of Iran are not the Iranian government. They are a 90 million person nation with one of the youngest, most educated populations in the Middle East. The protesters who risked their lives in January 2026 were not chanting for America.
They were chanting for their own freedom, for their own dignity, for a future that their government had stolen from them through 40 years of theocratic mismanagement, economic corruption, and military adventurism. Whatever you think about the decision to strike Iran, those people deserve to be seen. Their courage deserves acknowledgement, because in the end, any lasting peace in that region will have to be built by Iranians themselves. And right now, millions of them are watching their country burn, caught between a regime that used them as human shields for decades and a military operation that chose bombs over ballot boxes. The full story of why the US and Israel attacked Iran is not simple. It is not a story of pure heroes and pure villains. It is a story of real threats and real miscalculations, of intelligence failures and intelligence successes, of nuclear ambitions and geopolitical interests, of a decades-long Cold War that finally turned hot. And it's a story that is still being written. What we do with this moment, how America navigates the weeks and months ahead, will shape the Middle East, the global economy, and American credibility for a generation. So pay attention, because whether you wanted to be part of this story or not, you already are.